The rising storm. The sun had barely risen, casting long, pale shadows across the quiet streets of Brookhaven. Peyton Thompson, a 12-year-old boy with wiry strength and a determined gaze, was already awake, standing at the window of his family's small house. His mother, Denise, had warned him about the storm last night, but like every other storm, he thought it would pass. Yet as he stared at the ominous gray clouds rolling in from the horizon, a knot twisted in his stomach. This one felt different. Rain began to patter against the glass, soft at first, then louder, like fingers drumming urgently. Denise bustled into the room, her face tight with worry, carrying Peyton's little sister, Mia, who clung to her stuffed bear. "Peyton, close that window," Denise said, her voice sharper than usual. "We need to get things ready in case the storm gets worse." Peyton obeyed, snapping the window shut. "It's just rain, Mom," he muttered, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Denise shot him a knowing look. "It's never just rain, not here. You remember what happened 2 years ago." Peyton didn't need reminding. He still dreamed of the night when the floodwaters swallowed their neighborhood, forcing them to climb onto the roof and wait for rescue. That time, they'd been lucky. His grandpa hadn't been so fortunate. The sound of sirens in the distance jolted him back to the present. Peyton glanced out the window again and saw neighbors rushing down the street, their arms loaded with bags and supplies. Some carried children, others struggled with pets. The air buzzed with urgency. Peyton grabbed the flashlight and the emergency kit. Denise called, shifting Mia to her other hip. "I need to check the pantry." He nodded, moving quickly to the hall closet. The flashlight was easy to find, its weight familiar in his hand, but the emergency kit was buried under a pile of old blankets. He dug it out and carried both items to the kitchen, where his mother was stacking canned goods on the counter. "Do you think it'll flood again?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Denise paused, her fingers lingering on a can of beans. "I don't know, baby. I hope not, but we need to be ready." Her gaze softened, and she reached out to ruffle his hair. "Don't worry. We've been through worse." Peyton nodded, but the unease didn't leave him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this storm was going to test them in ways they hadn't been tested before. By mid-morning, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour. Peyton watched as the street outside transformed into a flowing river, the water rising steadily. He tugged on his raincoat, which was a size too small, the sleeves barely reaching his wrists. "Where are you going?" Denise asked, setting Mia down with a box of crayons. "Just to check on Mrs. Carter," Peyton replied. "She's alone, and her porch floods fast." Denise hesitated, then sighed. "Be quick. And stay close to the house, you hear me?" "I will," Peyton promised. The rain hit him like a cold slap as he stepped outside. The water had already swallowed the street, rising past his ankles. He splashed his way to Mrs. Carter's house, knocking loudly on the door. It took a moment before the frail, elderly woman answered, her face pale and drawn. "Mrs. Carter, you need to come with me," Peyton shouted over the roar of the rain. "The water's rising too fast." She hesitated, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. "But my house. It's not safe," Peyton insisted, grabbing her hand. "Come on." He led her to higher ground, where another neighbor took over, guiding her to safety. Peyton barely had time to catch his breath before he saw something that made his heart race. Mr. George, the old man who lived at the corner, struggling in the rapidly rising water. He was clinging to his mailbox, his feet submerged up to his knees, his face a mask of fear. "Help!" Mr. George shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. Peyton didn't think twice. He waded through the water, which now reached his thighs, each step a battle against the current. When he reached Mr. George, the man's grip on the mailbox was slipping, his legs trembling. "Peyton, you shouldn't be here," Mr. George gasped. "The water's too strong." "I'm not leaving you," Peyton shouted back. He grabbed Mr. George's arm, wrapping it around his shoulder. The old man was heavy, and the current fought against them. But Peyton planted his feet and pushed forward. It was slow, grueling work. Peyton's muscles burned, and the cold water sapped his strength, but he refused to let go. Memories of his grandfather flashed through his mind. The helplessness he'd felt watching the floodwaters take him. He wouldn't let it happen again. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the porch of a nearby house, which was just above the waterline. Peyton practically dragged Mr. George onto the steps before collapsing beside him, gasping for air. The rain pounded down on them, relentless. "You saved me," Mr. George wheezed, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to thank you, boy." Peyton shook his head, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "You don't have to. I couldn't just leave you." They sat there for a moment, shivering as the water continued to rise. Peyton knew they couldn't stay there forever. Rescue teams would come eventually. But until then, they were on their own. "Stay with me, Mr. George," Peyton said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. "We'll figure this out." Mr. George nodded weakly, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You're a brave boy, Peyton. Your grandpa would be proud." Peyton swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his eyes. He wasn't sure if he was brave. He just knew he couldn't let someone else be swept away. As the rain continued to fall, he scanned the waterlogged street, searching for their next move. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The struggle for survival. Peyton sat on the porch beside Mr. George, his heart pounding as he surveyed the rising floodwaters. Every instinct in his body screamed to keep moving, to find higher ground before the relentless current consumed them. The house they perched on wasn't going to hold for long. The water was already licking at the base of the steps, rising faster than he thought possible. "Mr. George," Peyton said, his voice steady but urgent, "we can't stay here. We need to get to that garage over there." He pointed to a structure nearby, its roof barely visible through the sheets of rain. Mr. George squinted at the distance, then shook his head, his face pale. "Son, you don't have to risk yourself for me. You've done enough. If I slow you down—" "No." Peyton cut him off, his voice firm. "We're doing this together. I promised. No one gets left behind." His resolve hardened as he stood, his rain-soaked sneakers squelching against the wooden steps. "I'll help you every step of the way." The old man looked at Peyton, his eyes glistening with something between fear and admiration. Finally, he nodded. "All right, boy. Let's do this." Peyton slung Mr. George's arm over his shoulder, bracing himself as they stepped off the porch. The icy water surged around their legs, threatening to sweep them off their feet. Peyton gritted his teeth, every step a battle against the current. The garage looked impossibly far away, and every second spent in the water drained his strength. "Hold tight to me," Peyton said, his voice trained. "We'll take it slow." Mr. George nodded, leaning heavily against the boy. "You're stronger than you look, Peyton." Peyton forced a grin despite the effort it took just to move. "I get it from my mom," he replied, his words punctuated by gasps for air. The current slammed against them, tugging at his legs, but he refused to stop. Each step brought them closer to the garage, and he clung to that goal like a lifeline. Midway through their journey, disaster struck. A large piece of debris, a splintered wooden beam, came hurtling down the street, carried by the rushing water. Peyton saw it at the last second, his heart lurching in terror. "Duck!" he shouted, pulling Mr. George down with him. The beam passed inches above their heads, its sharp edges glinting in the dim light. The force of the water as it passed nearly knocked them over, but Peyton managed to stay upright, his legs trembling from the strain. "You okay, Mr. George?" Peyton asked, his voice tight. The old man nodded, his breathing labored. "I'm fine, son. Let's keep going." The garage was closer now, the sight of its weathered drainpipe giving Peyton a sliver of hope. If they could just reach it, they could climb to safety. He adjusted his grip on Mr. George and pushed forward, the water now reaching his waist. His muscles burned, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to give in. Finally, they'd reached the garage wall. Peyton leaned against it, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. Mr. George sagged against him, his weight almost too much to bear. "Here," Peyton said, pointing to the drainpipe. "I'll help you climb first." Mr. George looked up at the rusted pipe, doubt etched across his face. "That thing doesn't look like it'll hold, boy." "It'll hold," Peyton insisted, more to convince himself than Mr. George. "It has to." He braced himself beneath the pipe, steadying Mr. George as the old man reached up and grabbed hold. The pipe groaned under the weight, but it didn't give way. Slowly, painfully, Mr. George began to climb, his frail body shaking with effort. "You're doing great," Peyton said, his voice encouraging. "Just a little more." The pipe wobbled dangerously, and Peyton's heart jumped into his throat. He positioned himself beneath Mr. George, ready to catch him if he fell. Inch by inch, the old man made his way up until, with one final push, he collapsed onto the roof. Peyton exhaled a shaky breath, his relief short-lived as the water rose higher around him. He grabbed the pipe, his hands numb from the cold, and pulled himself up as quickly as he could. The metal was slick and unsteady, but he didn't stop until he swung his leg over the edge and dropped onto the roof beside Mr. George. They lay there for a moment, the rain pelting them mercilessly. Peyton stared up at the gray sky, his chest heaving, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. You saved me again," Mr. George said, his voice hoarse. He turned to Peyton, his eyes wide with gratitude. "You're a brave boy, Peyton. I don't know how to thank you." Peyton shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just stay alive, Mr. George. That's all I need." The roof creaked ominously beneath them, a reminder that they weren't out of danger yet. Peyton sat up, scanning the flooded neighborhood. The water stretched out in every direction, littered with debris and broken pieces of people's lives. He couldn't see any rescue teams, no lights, no boats. They were still on their own. "We need a plan," Peyton said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We can't stay here. This roof won't hold forever." Mr. George nodded weakly, his face pale. "I'll follow your lead, son. You've got a good head on your shoulders." Peyton's gaze landed on a house farther down the street, its roof slightly higher than the garage. It wasn't much, but it was the best option they had. "We'll head there," he said, pointing. "It's higher ground. We'll be safer there." Mr. George followed his gaze and swallowed hard. "That's a long way, Peyton. Are you sure we can make it?" "We don't have a choice," Peyton replied, determination hardening his voice. "We'll take it one step at a time." The old man nodded, his trust in Peyton unshakable. "All right, son. Lead the way." Peyton stood, his legs shaking beneath him, and helped Mr. George to his feet. The wind howled around them, and the rain lashed against their faces, but Peyton didn't let it stop him. He tightened his grip on Mr. George and took a deep breath. "We're going to make it," he said, more to himself than to Mr. George. "We have to." As they prepared to make the treacherous journey to the next house, Peyton felt a flicker of something deep inside him. Something stronger than fear. It was hope, fragile but unyielding, and it pushed him forward even as the storm raged on. Through the flood's grip, Peyton tightened his grip on Mr. George's arm, glancing at the torrent below them. The sound of rushing water was deafening, each surge carrying more debris, tree branches, shattered pieces of furniture, and even a child's bicycle. The roof they stood on groaned again under the weight of the storm, a sharp reminder that their time there was limited. "We'll go slow," Peyton said, his voice steady. He pointed toward the neighboring house, its roof barely visible through the sheets of rain. "One step at a time. We can make it." Mr. George nodded, his face pale and weary. "You lead, son. I'll follow." The old man's trust weighed heavily on Peyton, but it also strengthened his resolve. He couldn't let fear paralyze him now. Their survival depended on him staying focused and strong. He stepped to the edge of the roof, testing the stability of the shingles. They were slick with rain, but they held. He turned back to Mr. George. "Hold on to me when we go. If you feel unsteady, just tell me, okay?" The old man gave a faint nod, and they started forward. Each step felt like a gamble, the roof's slope threatening to send them sliding into the churning waters below. Peyton adjusted his footing carefully, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind whipped against them, threatening to knock them off balance. But he gritted his teeth and pressed on. Midway across the roof, Peyton heard it, a loud, splintering crack. He froze, his eyes darting toward the sound. The garage below them was buckling, the floodwaters tearing at its foundation. His stomach twisted. "We have to move faster," he said, urgency lacing his voice. "Do what you have to, boy," Mr. George replied, clutching Peyton's shoulder tightly. They scrambled the rest of the way, the roof beneath them shifting ominously. Just as they reached the edge, the garage collapsed in a thunderous crash, sending splinters and debris flying into the air. Peyton shielded Mr. George as the structure crumbled, the sound reverberating through the storm. Breathing hard, Peyton steadied himself. "We're not done yet," he said, eyeing the gap between the garage and the next house. It was wider than he remembered, the water raging below making it look even more dangerous. Peyton looked at Mr. George. "I'll jump first. Once I'm over, I'll help you across." The old man hesitated, his face etched with worry. "You sure about this, son?" Peyton gave a firm nod. "We don't have a choice." Without waiting for further discussion, Peyton stepped back, took a running start, and leaped. For a split second, he was airborne, the cold wind biting at his soaked clothes. His feet hit the next roof with a jarring thud, and he stumbled, almost losing his balance. But he caught himself, steadying his legs beneath him. Turning back, he shouted through the rain, "Okay, Mr. George, your turn." The old man hesitated at the edge, gripping a piece of the collapsed roof for balance. "I'm not as spree as you, Peyton," he said, his voice trembling. "You can do it." Peyton called back, his voice full of encouragement. "Just jump. I'll catch you if I have to." Mr. George nodded, his jaw set with determination. He stepped to the edge, took a deep breath, and jumped. Peyton lunged forward, grabbing Mr. George's arm as his feet slipped on the slick roof. With a grunt, Peyton pulled him up, both of them collapsing in a heap. "See," Peyton said, his voice breathless but triumphant. "You made it." Mr. George gave a shaky laugh, clutching Peyton's shoulder. "Only because of you, boy. You've got the strength of a man twice your age." Peyton managed a small smile, but his mind was already on the next step. They were on a slightly safer roof, but the water was still rising, and the storm showed no signs of relenting. He scanned their surroundings, searching for another haven, another move to keep them alive. That's when he saw it, faint but unmistakable. A light. It flickered in the distance, bobbing and weaving like a beacon. It wasn't natural, not part of the storm. It had to be a flashlight or a lantern. Hope surged in his chest. "Mr. George," Peyton said, pointing toward the light. "Someone's out there. Maybe it's rescue teams." The old man squinted through the rain, his brow furrowed. "You sure it's not just someone else like us?" "Doesn't matter," Peyton said firmly. "It's people. We just have to get to them." The next house between them, and the light was half submerged, its roof completely inaccessible. Peyton's mind raced, searching for a solution. The current below them was fierce, but above it, a series of cables stretched from one utility pole to another. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. "See those cables?" Peyton asked, pointing. Mr. George followed his gaze, his eyes widening. "You're not seriously thinking." "It's the only way," Peyton interrupted. "If we can get to that cable, we can use it to cross to the next dry spot. It's risky, but staying here is worse. The old man swallowed hard but didn't argue. You've got more guts than anyone I've ever met, Peyton. Peyton didn't feel brave. His hand shook as he steadied Mr. George. Together, they made their way toward the utility pole, their progress slow but determined. The pole stood just a few feet from the edge of the roof, its base surrounded by swirling water. Peyton climbed first, the cold, slick wood testing his grip. His heart hammered as he reached the cable, its surface rough against his hands. He tested its strength, tugging on it until he was confident it would hold. "Okay, Mr. George, your turn." The old man climbed with surprising tenacity, his face grim with concentration. Peyton helped him onto the cable, positioning himself behind him to steady the man's movements. Hand over hand, they inched their way across, the cable swaying under their combined weight. The journey was agonizing. The wind tugged at them, and the rain made every grip slippery and uncertain. Peyton's muscles screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and kept going. Below them, the water churned, a relentless reminder of what awaited if they fell. Almost there, Peyton called, his voice strained. Just a few more feet. Finally, they reached the other side. Peyton helped Mr. George onto the rooftop, both of them collapsing in exhaustion. The light they'd seen earlier was closer now, brighter and more distinct. Peyton could make out figures moving in the distance, their shouts faint but clear. "They're coming," he said, his voice thick with relief. "We just have to hold on a little longer." Mr. George grasped his hand, his grip weak but full of gratitude. "You've done more for me than I ever thought possible, Peyton. I'll never forget this." Peyton smiled, his exhaustion fading under the warmth of those words. "We're not done yet, Mr. George. Let's get you home." The light grew brighter, the shouts louder, and for the first time, Peyton allowed himself to believe they might make it. They just had to hold on. The edge of hope. Peyton and Mr. George lay on the roof, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and cold. The light in the distance danced like a beacon, a fragile promise of salvation. Peyton's breaths came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he tried to muster the strength to stand again. Mr. George was pale, his eyes half closed, but he was alive. That was what mattered most. The storm was relentless, the rain pounding down harder than ever. The wind howled like a beast, tearing at their clothes and pushing them closer to the edge. Peyton clenched his fists, digging deep to find the resolve to keep going. "We can't stop here, Mr. George," he said, his voice hoarse but determined. "That light, it's help. I know it is." The old man opened his eyes, his expression weary but trusting. "You've led me this far, boy. I'll follow you wherever we need to go." Peyton nodded, his jaw tightening. He glanced at the waterlogged streets below. The current had grown stronger, sweeping away what little remained of the neighborhood. Roofs, fences, and cars were either submerged or drifting aimlessly, carried by the relentless tide. He spotted a partially submerged truck wedged between two houses, its cab tilted at an angle. The truck's roof was just visible above the waterline, offering a precarious but viable path toward the next house. Beyond that, the light glowed brighter, and the faint silhouettes of people moving gave him hope. "We're going to use that truck to cross," Peyton said, pointing. Mr. George followed his gaze, his face tightening with apprehension. "That doesn't look stable, son." "It's the best option we have," Peyton replied, his tone resolute. "I'll go first and make sure it's safe. Once I'm across, I'll help you." Peyton didn't wait for an argument. He stood on shaky legs and took a deep breath, the cold wind biting at his face. His rain-soaked sneakers slipped on the wet shingles as he lowered himself toward the edge of the roof. The gap between the roof and the truck wasn't wide, but the rushing water below made it feel like an endless chasm. "Careful, boy," Mr. George called, his voice strained. Peyton nodded, gripping the edge of the roof tightly. He crouched, his heart hammering in his chest, then leaped. His feet landed on the truck's cab with a dull thud, and he stumbled, his arms windmilling to keep his balance. The metal was slick with rain and tilted at an awkward angle, but it held. "I'm good," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Come on, Mr. George, you can do this." The old man hesitated, his face pale with fear. Peyton could see his hands trembling as he gripped the roof's edge. "You've got this," Peyton called, his tone firm but encouraging. "One jump, and I'll catch you if you slip." Mr. George closed his eyes for a moment, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Then, with a shaky breath, he stepped to the edge and jumped. Peyton lunged forward, grabbing the old man's arm as his feet slipped on the truck's cab. Together, they steadied themselves, the truck groaning under their combined weight. "You did it," Peyton said, a grin breaking through his exhaustion. Mr. George let out a shaky laugh, his grip on Peyton's shoulder tightening. "Only because of you, boy. Only because of you." The truck wasn't a place to linger. Peyton quickly guided Mr. George toward the back, where the truck bed offered a slightly more stable platform. From there, the gap to the next roof was smaller, but the water was rising fast, licking at the edges of the truck. "We've got to move," Peyton said, urgency creeping into his voice. He helped Mr. George onto the roof, then climbed up himself, both of them collapsing in relief. The light was closer now, and Peyton could hear voices calling through the storm. He stood, his legs trembling, and waved his arms wildly. "Over here," he shouted, his voice cracking from the strain. "We need help." The figures in the distance turned toward them, their voices growing louder. Peyton's heart leaped as he saw a small boat, its motor struggling against the current, making its way toward them. The boat carried 3 people in bright raincoats, their faces obscured by the storm, but their presence was unmistakable: rescue workers. "They see us," Peyton said, turning to Mr. George. Relief washed over him, threatening to buckle his knees. "We're going to be okay." The boat drew closer, navigating the debris-filled water with practiced precision. One of the rescuers stood at the bow, shouting through a megaphone. "Stay where you are. We'll get to you." Peyton waved again, tears stinging his eyes as the boat approached. The rescuers threw a rope toward the roof, which Peyton caught with numb fingers. He secured it to a sturdy piece of the chimney, giving the rescuers a line to anchor the boat. One of the rescuers climbed onto the roof, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. "You're both coming with us," he said, his voice steady. He turned to Mr. George, kneeling to check his condition. "Sir, are you injured?" "I'm fine, just tired," Mr. George replied, his voice weak. "But this boy, he's the reason I'm still here." The rescuer turned to Peyton, his gaze softening. "You've done a good job, kid. We'll take it from here." Peyton nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He helped Mr. George into the harness the rescuers provided, watching as they carefully lowered him into the boat. Then it was Peyton's turn. The rescuer gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder as he secured the harness around him. "You're safe now," the man said. As Peyton was lowered into the boat, the relief finally hit him. His body sagged, the adrenaline that had carried him through the storm draining away. He sat beside Mr. George, clutching the side of the boat as they navigated the treacherous waters back toward higher ground. The journey was surreal. Peyton watched the ruined neighborhood pass by, the devastation stark and heartbreaking. Families huddled on rooftops, waving frantically for help. Some houses were completely submerged, leaving only the tops of trees and power poles visible. The storm had spared no one. When they reached the emergency shelter, a school gymnasium converted into a rescue center, Peyton could barely walk. The rescuers helped him inside, where rows of cots lined the walls, each one occupied by someone displaced by the flood. Volunteers moved through the crowd, handing out blankets, water, and warm food. Denise's face appeared in the crowd, her expression shifting from panic to overwhelming relief when she saw Peyton. "Peyton," she cried, rushing toward him. "Mom, Peyton's voice broke as he ran to her, collapsing into her arms. The weight of the day finally caught up to him, and tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry. Shay," Denise whispered, holding him tightly. "You're safe. That's all that matters. You're safe." Mia clung to his side, her tiny arms wrapped around him. "I was so scared, Peyton," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. "I thought you wouldn't come back. I promised, didn't I?" Peyton said, forcing a smile through his tears. "I'll always come back." Denise kissed his forehead, her tears mixing with his. "You're so brave, Peyton. I don't know how you did it, but I'm so proud of you." He didn't feel brave. He felt exhausted, broken, and overwhelmed. But as he held his family close, he realized something. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived. Across the gym, Mr. George caught his eye and gave him a small, grateful nod. Peyton nodded back, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. They weren't just survivors. They were a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a beacon of gratitude. The storm had passed, but its aftermath loomed over Brookhaven like a shadow. The sun had risen, casting an unflinching light on the destruction that lay everywhere. Streets transformed into rivers, houses reduced to skeletons, and lives uprooted. Peyton sat on a cot in the gymnasium, his family beside him, exhaustion written on their faces. The murmur of voices surrounded them, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and determination. Denise handed Peyton a bowl of warm soup, her touch lingering on his shoulder. "Eat, baby," she said softly. "You need your strength." Peyton nodded and took the bowl, the simple act of holding something warm grounding him. Mia sat at his side, clutching her stuffed bear, which was still damp but intact. Her wide eyes scanned the room, a mixture of curiosity and unease. "Mom, are we going to live here now?" she asked, her voice small. Denise hesitated, her eyes flicking to Peyton, as if searching for the right words. "Only for a little while, sweetheart. Just until we figure things out." Peyton's spoon paused midair. He didn't want Mia to sense how uncertain everything felt. He set the bowl down and smiled at her. "We'll make it, Mia, just like we always do." She gave him a small nod, her trust in him absolute, and returned to brushing the fur of her bear with her fingers. As Peyton ate, he noticed Mr. George a few cots down, his frail frame propped up by pillows. A young woman in a nurse's uniform was checking his vitals, and Mr. George waved her off with a grumble, though his eyes softened when they landed on Peyton. "Boy," Mr. George called, his voice still hoarse but steady. "Come here a moment." Peyton glanced at his mom, who nodded. "Go ahead," she said, smiling. He set his soup aside and crossed the gymnasium, weaving through families and volunteers. When he reached Mr. George, the old man gestured for him to sit on the edge of the cot. "You doing all right, Mr. George?" Peyton asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Thanks to you. I'm here to answer that question," Mr. George replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "The rescuers told me about the risks you took, crossing roofs and climbing those utility poles. You saved my life. Son, don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough for that." Peyton shrugged, his face flushing. "I just did what I had to. Anyone else would have done the same." Mr. George chuckled, a raspy sound that softened the lines of his weathered face. "That humility of yours, it's rare, but don't downplay what you did. You've got the heart of a hero, Peyton." Peyton shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. He wasn't a hero, just a kid who couldn't stand to see someone else suffer. Mr. George's expression grew serious. "Listen, son, I've lived a long life. Seen my share of storms, floods, and even wars. But what you did out there, that kind of courage and kindness, it's what the world needs more of." Peyton glanced down at his hands, his chest tightening. He thought of his grandpa, of how helpless he'd felt during that flood years ago. This time, he'd done something, but the weight of responsibility still lingered. "You remind me of my son, Richard," Mr. George continued, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. "He's a good man, but we've had our differences. After everything that's happened, I think it's time I reached out to him." Peyton nodded. "You should. Family's important." Mr. George smiled warmly. "You're wise beyond your years, Peyton. I've got something for you." He reached under the blanket and pulled out a small battered notebook. "I kept a lot of memories in here over the years. Stories, lessons, and things I wanted to pass down. I don't have much left to give, but I'd like you to have this." Peyton hesitated, his eyes widening. "Mr. George, I can't." "You can," Mr. George interrupted, pressing the notebook into his hands. "It's yours now. I think you'll know what to do with it." Peyton held the notebook, its worn cover rough against his fingers. It felt like a piece of history, heavy with meaning. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Don't thank me," Mr. George replied, leaning back against the pillows. "Just keep being the boy your family and this neighborhood can count on." Later that day, Peyton sat on the gym floor with Mia while Denise met with a volunteer about their next steps. He opened the notebook, his curiosity getting the better of him. Inside were handwritten notes, faded photographs, and sketches of places Peyton didn't recognize. Each page told a story, some about Mr. George's childhood, others about lessons he learned over the years. One entry stood out, written in neat cursive. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act in spite of it. When you help others, even when it's hard, you give them a reason to believe in something better." Peyton ran his fingers over the words, their weight sinking in. He glanced at Mia, who was doodling on a scrap of paper, and thought about how much she looked up to him. He thought about his mom, who carried so much on her shoulders, and about Mr. George, who had put his trust in him when it mattered most. This wasn't just about surviving the flood. It was about rebuilding homes, lives, and hope. That evening, a surprise visitor arrived at the shelter. A sleek black car pulled up outside, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the mud-slicked streets. Peyton noticed it immediately, his curiosity piqued. The car door opened, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped out, his face unfamiliar but kind. The man entered the gymnasium, his sharp eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mr. George. Peyton watched as the two embraced, the man's shoulders shaking slightly. "That's my son," Mr. George said softly when Peyton approached. "Richard." Richard turned to Peyton, his expression shifting to one of gratitude. "You must be Peyton," he said, extending a hand. "My father's told me everything. I don't have the words to thank you for what you did." Peyton shook his hand, feeling a little overwhelmed. "I just did what anyone would have done." Richard smiled. "Well, I'd say you did more than most. My father wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Before Peyton could respond, Richard pulled an envelope from his pocket. "My family, and I wanted to do something to help you and your family. This isn't enough to repay what you've done, but it's a start." Peyton hesitated as Richard handed him the envelope. It was thick, its contents undoubtedly significant. "I don't know if I can take this." "It's not charity," Richard said firmly. "It's gratitude. Use it to rebuild your home, to make things a little easier." Peyton looked at his mom, who had approached quietly, her expression a mixture of surprise and emotion. She gave him a small nod, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," Denise said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much this means." Richard placed a hand on Peyton's shoulder. "You've got a bright future ahead of you, Peyton. Don't ever lose that courage." As the black car pulled away, Peyton stood beside his mom and sister, the envelope heavy in his hands. It wasn't just money. It was a chance to start anew. Denise wrapped an arm around him, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given us more than a way to rebuild, Peyton. You've given us hope." Peyton looked at his family, at the people around them, and nodded. "We're going to be okay, Mom. We've got each other, and that's enough." As the night settled over the shelter, Peyton opened the notebook again, reading Mr. George's words by the faint glow of the emergency lights. They weren't just words anymore. They were a guide, a reminder that even in the darkest times, courage and kindness could light the way forward. Rebuilding together. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the broken windows of the shelter's gymnasium, painting the floor with soft, golden patches of warmth. It was the first clear day in over a week, the storm's aftermath finally giving way to a fragile sense of peace. Peyton woke up feeling sore but lighter, as if the sunlight itself had managed to peel away some of the burden he'd been carrying. Denise had already been up for hours, speaking with volunteers and neighbors about their next steps. When Peyton opened his eyes, he saw her sitting at a makeshift table with Mia, sketching out plans for their home on a piece of scrap paper. "Morning, sleepyhead," Denise said with a smile when she noticed him stirring. "Mia and I were talking about the house. We've got work to do, but I think we can make it even better than before." Mia beamed, holding up a crayon drawing of their house surrounded by trees and sunshine. "Look, Peyton, I made it so it's happy again." Peyton smiled, his chest swelling with pride and affection. "That's a good plan, Mia. I'll help make it just like your picture." He got up and stretched, his muscles aching from the days of strain. Despite the discomfort, there was a renewed energy in him, a determination to help rebuild not just their home but their community. The envelope Richard had given them sat on the corner of the table, its contents untouched for now. Denise had insisted they be careful about how they used it. "It's not just money," she told Peyton the night before. "It's a second chance." By mid-morning, the shelter was alive with activity. Families were gathering supplies, volunteers were organizing repair teams, and conversations buzzed about rebuilding efforts. Peyton felt a sense of purpose as he helped distribute donated tools to the other families. The gymnasium, once filled with fear and exhaustion, now brimmed with hope and determination. "Peyton," a familiar voice called. He turned to see Marcus, his friend from down the street, waving at him. Marcus looked tired, but was smiling nonetheless. His family's house had taken heavy damage during the flood, but they were already making plans to fix it up. "Hey," Peyton called back, jogging over to meet him. "How's your family?" "We're doing okay," Marcus said. "Dad's already out there with some neighbors clearing debris. Figured I'd come grab some supplies and see if you wanted to join us." Peyton hesitated, glancing back at Denise. She caught his look and waved him off. "Go," she said. "We'll be fine here." Peyton grinned and grabbed a hammer and a pair of gloves from the supply table. "Let's do it." The streets of Brookhaven were unrecognizable. Mud and debris covered nearly every surface, and the air carried the sharp tang of wet wood and stagnant water. Peyton and Marcus joined a group of neighbors clearing fallen trees and broken furniture from the main road. The work was grueling, the sun beating down on them as they hacked away at the wreckage. "This used to be Mr. Carter's fence," Marcus said, tossing a splintered board into a pile. "Crazy how everything's just gone." Peyton nodded, his gaze distant. "Yeah, but we'll build it back. Stronger this time." As they worked, more neighbors joined them. Mr. Jenkins, the retired handyman from 2 streets over, arrived with his toolbox, offering tips on how to salvage materials. A group of teenagers from the shelter showed up with shovels, their laughter cutting through the otherwise somber atmosphere. Even Mrs. Carter, who was nearly 80, brought out sandwiches and water for everyone. Peyton felt a strange sense of unity growing among the crowd. These weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a team, bound by shared loss and a common goal. By the time the sun began to dip in the sky, the road was mostly cleared. Peyton leaned against a tree stump, wiping the sweat from his brow. His hands were blistered, and his arms ached, but the sight of the newly cleared street filled him with pride. "We did good," Marcus said, dropping beside him. "Feels like we're actually getting somewhere." Peyton nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the faint outlines of houses still stood, battered but standing. "Yeah, we'll get there." As they rested, A familiar figure approached. Mr. George walked toward them, supported by a cane one of the volunteers had given him. His steps were slow, but his expression was determined. "Peyton," Mr. George called, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. "Got a minute?" Peyton stood, motioning for Marcus to wait. He walked over to Mr. George, who gave him a small, knowing smile. "You've been busy," Mr. George said, gesturing to the cleared road. "Good to see young folks stepping up." Peyton shrugged. "It's what needs to be done." Mr. George's smile widened. "That's the spirit. But I wanted to talk to you about something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "My son Richard wanted me to give this to you. Said it was his way of making sure you had everything you needed." Peyton unfolded the paper, his eyes widening as he read the words. It was a note promising additional support, a donation of construction materials, tools, and even volunteers from a local company Richard had connections with. It wasn't just money. It was the means to rebuild not just their home, but the neighborhood. I don't know what to say," Peyton stammered, his throat tight. "Say you'll use it wisely," Mr. George replied, his tone gentle but firm. "Because if anyone deserves this, it's you and your family." Peyton nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will. Thank you, Mr. George." That evening, back at the shelter, Peyton shared the news with Denise and Mia. Tears welled in Denise's eyes as she read the note, her fingers trembling. "This changes everything," she whispered. "We can rebuild faster. We can help the others." Peyton smiled, the weight of the day's work melting into a sense of accomplishment. "We're not just fixing our house, Mom. We're fixing the whole neighborhood." Denise hugged him tightly, her voice filled with emotion. "You've done so much, Peyton. More than I ever thought possible. I'm so proud of you." Mia joined the hug, her little arms wrapping around them both. "Can we make my room just like my drawing?" she asked, her voice hopeful. Peyton laughed, ruffling her hair. "Better than your drawing, Mia. We'll make it perfect." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With the donated materials and the help of the neighborhood, the rebuilding efforts accelerated. Peyton worked tirelessly, hauling wood, hammering nails, and painting walls. He wasn't just fixing his family's home. He was helping neighbors repair roofs, clear debris, and rebuild lives. The neighborhood began to transform. Houses once left in ruins now stood proud and sturdy. Streets once covered in mud became clear and walkable. The laughter of children returned, a sound that had been missing for far too long. Peyton found himself at the center of it all. Neighbors looked to him for guidance, trusting his quiet determination and willingness to help. It felt strange, but also right. He wasn't just a kid anymore. He was a leader. One evening, as the sun set over Brookhaven, Peyton stood in front of his newly rebuilt house. The walls gleamed with fresh paint, the windows sparkled, and the roof was whole again. Denise and Mia stood beside him, their faces glowing with pride. "We did it," Denise said, her voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." Peyton nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Yeah, Mom, we did." As the neighborhood lights flickered on one by one, Peyton realized they had done more than rebuild houses. They had rebuilt hope, unity, and a future worth fighting for. A new foundation. The first morning in their rebuilt house was surreal. Peyton woke to the sound of birds chirping outside, a stark contrast to the weeks of relentless rain and chaos. The sunlight streamed through the new window in his room, illuminating the freshly painted walls. For a moment, he just lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the realization sink in. They had done it. They were home. Downstairs, Denise was already bustling about the kitchen, humming softly to herself. The smell of toast and scrambled eggs filled the air, a scent Peyton hadn't realized he missed so much. He walked into the kitchen to find Mia sitting at the table, her stuffed bear propped up beside her, its fur now clean and fluffy. "Morning, champ," Denise said, turning to smile at him. Her face, though still etched with traces of exhaustion, glowed with a quiet joy. "Sleep okay?" Peyton nodded, sitting across from Mia. "Yeah, I did. It feels weird. Good, but weird." Denise placed a plate of eggs in front of him, patting his shoulder. "That's because it's been a long time since we've had peace, Peyton. We've earned this." Mia looked up from her plate, her eyes bright. "Are we staying here forever now, Peyton? No more shelters?" Peyton leaned forward, smiling at her. "Yeah, Mia. No more shelters. This is our home." Mia grinned, her little hands clutching her fork. "Good. I like it here. It's happy again." After breakfast, Peyton stepped outside, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. The neighborhood was a flurry of activity as families continued their rebuilding efforts. The streets were alive with the sounds of hammers and saws, punctuated by laughter and chatter. The scars of the flood were still visible, but so was the determination to heal. "Peyton," Marcus called, jogging up the street with a toolbox in hand. "We're fixing up the community center today. You in?" Peyton grinned. "Of course. Let me grab my stuff." He ran back inside to grab his gloves and tools, telling Denise where he was heading. She nodded, her smile proud. "Be careful, and don't overdo it. You've already done so much." "Can't stop now, Mom," Peyton said, his voice filled with purpose. "There's still more to do." The community center had been one of the hardest-hit buildings in Brookhaven. Floodwaters had destroyed the interior, leaving the once vibrant space a shell of its former self. But it was also one of the most important places in the neighborhood, a gathering spot for meetings, celebrations, and support. When Peyton arrived, he found a group of neighbors already hard at work. Mr. Jenkins was there, directing a team of volunteers as they hauled out damaged furniture and tore down warped drywall. Mrs. Carter sat on a folding chair nearby, knitting something colorful while offering words of encouragement to everyone passing by. "Good to see you, Peyton," Mr. Jenkins said, tipping his hat. "We've got a lot of work to do, but with you here, I reckon we'll be done in no time." Peyton set to work immediately, teaming up with Marcus to clear debris from the main hall. The walls were stripped bare, and the floor was covered in mud, but Peyton could already envision what the center would look like when it was done. Bright, welcoming, a symbol of the community's resilience. As they worked, more people arrived, bringing tools, paint, and even food to share. It wasn't long before the atmosphere shifted from one of labor to one of celebration. Kids ran around outside, playing games while their parents hammered and painted. Someone brought a speaker, and music filled the air, turning the workday into a block party. At one point, Mr. George arrived, leaning on his cane but looking stronger than he had in weeks. "Thought I'd come see what all the fuss was about," he said, his eyes twinkling as he greeted Peyton. "You've got this place buzzing, boy." Peyton chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's not just me. Everyone's pitching in. And that's because of you," Mr. George said, his voice warm. "You showed this neighborhood what it means to look out for each other. Don't think we'll forget that." By late afternoon, the community center had transformed. The walls were freshly painted, the floors cleaned and repaired, and new tables and chairs donated by a local business had been arranged in the main hall. People stood back, admiring their work, their faces glowing with pride. "This looks incredible," Marcus said, clapping Peyton on the back. "We actually did it." Peyton nodded, his chest swelling with a sense of accomplishment. "Yeah, we did." Mrs. Carter walked up to them, her knitting project now a completed quilt draped over her arm. "This is for you, Peyton," she said, holding it out to him. "For everything you've done. You've kept this community going." Peyton hesitated, his cheeks flushing. "I don't know if I can take this, Mrs. Carter. You've worked so hard on it." "And so have you," she said firmly. "It's yours." Peyton accepted the quilt, its colorful patches stitched together with care. "Thank you, Mrs. Carter. This means a lot." "You mean a lot to all of us," she said, her smile soft. Don't you forget that." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood gathered outside the community center for an impromptu celebration. Someone had set up a grill, and the air filled with the smell of hot dogs and burgers. Kids laughed and played, their joy infectious, while adults shared stories and plans for the future. Peyton sat with his family on a picnic blanket, the quilt Mrs. Carter had given him draped over Maya's shoulders. Denise leaned against him, her eyes glistening as she watched the neighborhood come alive. "You did this," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. "You brought us all together, Peyton." He shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We did it, Mom. All of us." As the night wore on, Mr. George stood to address the gathering. His voice, though still raspy, carried the weight of wisdom and gratitude. "This flood took a lot from us," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "Homes, belongings, even loved ones. But it didn't take our spirit. And that's because of people like Peyton." All eyes turned to Peyton, and he felt his face flush under the weight of their gazes. "Peyton showed us what it means to be brave," Mr. George continued. "What it means to stand up for each other, even when it's hard. This boy didn't just save my life. He reminded us all what it means to be a community." The crowd erupted into applause, and Peyton's heart swelled. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but in that moment, he realized it wasn't about him. It was about all of them, the people who had come together to rebuild their lives and their homes. As the applause faded, Peyton stood, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. "I didn't do this alone. None of us did. We've all worked hard to get here, and we'll keep working hard to make Brookhaven better than ever." The cheers that followed were deafening, and for the first time in weeks, Peyton felt a deep, unshakable peace. They had survived the storm, and now they were rebuilding, not just their neighborhood, but their hope, their future. As the stars appeared overhead, Peyton sat back down with his family, his heart full. Brookhaven wasn't just a place. It was a testament to their resilience, their unity, and the strength they'd found in each other. They weren't just rebuilding houses. They were rebuilding a life worth living. And Peyton knew, no matter what came next, they would face it together. The heart of the community. The evening at the community center stretched on, a celebration of resilience and unity under the stars. Strings of twinkling lights hung between poles, casting a warm glow over the crowd. The smell of grilled food mingled with the crisp, fresh air, a reminder that the storm, though devastating, had not taken everything. Peyton sat with his family near the center of the gathering, his fingers tracing the edges of the quilt Mrs. Carter had gifted him. Its colorful patches told their own story, bright yellows, deep blues, and soft greens stitched together in a way that reminded him of the neighborhood. Different pieces, different lives, all connected to form something whole. Mia sat beside him, holding her stuffed bear and swinging her legs, a picture of pure joy. Denise leaned back, a rare smile on her face as she watched the neighbors mingle. Peyton followed her gaze, taking in the sight of families reunited, friends sharing stories, and children running freely. "This feels different," Denise said, her voice soft. "Like we're finally moving forward." Peyton nodded. "It's not just us anymore, Mom. It's everyone. We're all rebuilding together." The sound of someone tapping a microphone interrupted their conversation. Peyton turned to see Mr. Jenkins standing on a makeshift stage, his rugged hands gripping the podium. The crowd quieted, their attention shifting to the man who had become a leader in the recovery efforts. "Folks," Mr. Jenkins began, his deep voice carrying over the gathering. "I've lived in Brookhaven for over 40 years, seen storms come and go. But this one was different. It tested us in ways we never imagined." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But it didn't break us. Look around you. We're still here. We're rebuilding. And that's because of people like you. People who didn't give up, who stepped up to help their neighbors when it mattered most." The crowd murmured in agreement, some nodding, others clapping quietly. And there's one person in particular who's shown us what it means to lead with courage and kindness, Mr. Jenkins continued. A young man who reminded us all what it means to stand together. Peyton froze as Mr. Jenkins looked directly at him. The man smiled warmly and gestured for him to come up. Peyton Thompson, come on up here, son. The crowd erupted into applause, and Peyton felt his cheeks flush. He glanced at Denise, who gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes glistening with pride. Maya tugged on his sleeve, grinning. Go, Peyton. You're the hero. Peyton rose slowly, his legs trembling slightly as he made his way to the stage. The applause grew louder, and by the time he reached Mr. Jenkins, his heart was pounding in his chest. Mr. Jenkins clapped a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. This boy, Mr. Jenkins said, his voice filled with emotion, is the reason we're all here tonight. When the storm hit, Peyton didn't think about himself. He thought about his neighbors. He saved lives, risked his own safety, and brought this community together when we needed it most. Peyton opened his mouth to protest, to insist that he didn't do it alone, but Mr. Jenkins held up a hand. Now I know what you're going to say, Peyton, that it wasn't just you. And you're right. It wasn't. But someone has to take the first step, and you did. You showed us that even in the darkest times, there's light to be found if we stick together. The crowd cheered again, and Peyton felt a lump rise in his throat. He stepped up to the microphone, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. The sea of faces looking back at him wasn't intimidating. It was supportive, full of trust and gratitude. Thank you, he began, his voice shaky but growing steadier. But this isn't about me. It's about all of us. When the flood hit, I was scared. I didn't know what to do at first. But then I saw my neighbors, my friends, struggling. And I couldn't just stand by. He paused, his gaze drifting to Mr. George, who was seated near the front. Mr. George taught me something important, that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you are. That's what we all did. We stood up for each other. And that's what makes this neighborhood special. The crowd clapped again, some people wiping away tears. Peyton took a deep breath and continued. We've lost a lot, but we haven't lost everything. We have each other. And as long as we stick together, I know we can rebuild, stronger, better than before. He stepped back from the microphone, the applause washing over him like a wave. Mr. Jenkins pulled him into a brief hug, patting his back. Well said, son. Well said. As the evening wound down, the neighbors lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of the gathering. Peyton found himself surrounded by people offering handshakes, hugs, and words of thanks. It was overwhelming, but also deeply humbling. Peyton, Marcus called, approaching with a plate of food. You didn't tell me you were going to make a speech. Peyton laughed, shaking his head. I didn't know I was going to. Well, you nailed it, Marcus said, handing him a burger. Now eat. You've earned it. Peyton sat back down with his family, the weight of the day's events finally settling in. Denise wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. I meant what I said earlier, she whispered. I'm so proud of you, Peyton. He leaned into her, the exhaustion melting away under the warmth of her words. Thanks, Mom. I wanted to make things better. And you did, she replied, her voice steady. For all of us. Later that night, as they walked back to their rebuilt house, the neighborhood was quiet, the stars shining brightly above. Peyton carried Mia, who had fallen asleep in his arms, her stuffed bear tucked under one of his arms. Denise walked beside him, her steps lighter than they'd been in weeks. When they reached the house, Peyton tucked Mia into bed, pulling the quilt over her small frame. She stirred slightly, murmuring his name before settling into a peaceful sleep. Denise stood in the doorway, watching him with a smile. You've got a good heart, Peyton, she said softly. Your grandpa we've been so proud of you. Peyton looked up at her, his eyes glistening. Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. As he lay in bed later that night, the sounds of hammers and saws still echoing faintly in his mind, Peyton felt a deep sense of contentment. They weren't just rebuilding homes, they were rebuilding hope, trust, and a sense of belonging. Brookhaven wasn't just their neighborhood anymore, it was their family. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, Peyton knew they would face them together. A legacy of strength. Morning light spilled through the windows of Peyton's house, bathing the freshly painted walls in a warm glow. Outside, the sounds of life had returned to Brookhaven. Children laughing, neighbors chatting, and hammers echoing as the last of the repairs were underway. The storm was a memory now, but its impact lingered, not in the destruction it caused, but in the resilience it had brought out in the people. Peyton woke to the smell of breakfast. Denise had been up early, and the aroma of pancakes filled the air. He stretched, feeling the ache in his muscles, a reminder of the work they had done. It was a good ache, though, a testament to progress. Morning. Mia's voice rang out as she poked her head into his room. She was already dressed, her hair tied back in a ponytail, and her stuffed bear clutched in one hand. "Morning, Mia," Peyton said, smiling at her. "You're up early." "We're going to the park today," she said excitedly. "Everyone's going. Mom says they fixed the swings." Peyton chuckled. It had been months since the park had been safe to play in, and seeing Mia so excited reminded him of how much had changed. "I'll be ready in a bit," he said. Downstairs, Denise greeted him with a plate of pancakes and a smile. "Eat up. Big day today." Peyton raised an eyebrow as he sat down. "Big day? What's happening?" "You'll see," she said, her tone teasing. "Just finish your breakfast." Later that morning, the family walked to the park. It was a short distance from their house, but the journey felt like a victory lap. Along the way, they passed newly rebuilt homes and greeted neighbors who waved from porches or front yards. The devastation of the flood had been replaced with signs of renewal. Fresh coats of paint, repaired fences, and flowers blooming in freshly planted gardens. When they reached the park, Peyton stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The entire neighborhood seemed to be there, gathered under the sprawling oak trees that had survived the storm. Children ran across the grass, their laughter filling the air, while adults mingled near a long table piled with food and drinks. But what caught Peyton's attention most was the new addition to the park, a sturdy wooden bench under the largest tree, its surface gleaming in the sunlight. A small plaque was mounted on the backrest, and as Peyton approached, he saw his name etched into it. "In honor of Peyton Thompson, for bravery, kindness, and uniting the community." Peyton blinked, his heart pounding. He turned to Denise, who stood beside him, her eyes shining with pride. "This is for me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just for you," Mr. Jenkins said, stepping forward from the crowd. "For what you represent. Courage, compassion, the best of what this community can be." The crowd clapped, and Peyton felt his cheeks flush. He wanted to protest, to say that everyone had played a role, but the lump in his throat made it hard to speak. Instead, he nodded, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice trembling. "But this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. We came together when things were at their worst, and we made it through because we didn't give up on each other." The applause grew louder, and Peyton felt Denise's hand on his shoulder. "You earned this," she whispered. The celebration continued throughout the day, turning into a festival of sorts. Kids played on the newly repaired swings, their laughter blending with the music from a neighbor's portable speaker. Food was shared, stories were told, and the bonds between the residents of Brookhaven grew even stronger. Peyton spent much of the day helping where he could, setting up chairs, carrying supplies, and even joining in a game of soccer with Marcus and the other kids. But he also took moments to sit on the bench, reflecting on everything that had happened. The plaque was a reminder of the journey they'd been through, but it also felt like a responsibility, a promise to keep doing his part for the community. Later in the afternoon, Mr. George arrived, his son Richard helping him navigate the uneven ground. The old man looked stronger than he had in weeks, his steps more confident. When he reached Peyton, he gave him a nod of approval. "This bench suits you," Mr. George said, his tone warm. "You've left a mark on this neighborhood, boy. Don't ever forget that." Peyton smiled, shaking his head. "I just did what needed to be done. And that's exactly why you're the kind of person this community needs," Mr. George replied. He gestured to the crowd. "Look around you. These people believe in you. And more importantly, they believe in each other now." Peyton glanced around, taking in the smiling faces, the laughter, and the sense of unity that permeated the park. It was true. Brookhaven wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in shades of orange and gold, the gathering began to wind down. Families packed up their belongings, children were herded toward home, and the sounds of conversation softened. Peyton sat on the bench, Mia beside him, leaning against his arm. Denise stood nearby, talking with neighbors, her face alight with happiness. "Peyton," Maya said softly, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Yeah, Maya," he replied. "Do you think the storm will come back?" Peyton hesitated, his gaze following hers. The sky was clear now, a deep blue fading into twilight. But her question lingered. Finally, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Storms might come back," he said gently, "but we'll be ready for them. We've got each other, right?" Mia nodded, her trust in him unwavering. "Right." Denise joined them, sitting on Peyton's other side. She took his hand, her smile soft and full of pride. "You've done so much for us, Peyton, for this whole neighborhood. Your grandpa, we've been so proud." Peyton looked down at their hands, his chest tightening with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you and Mia. You kept me going." As the stars began to appear overhead, Peyton felt a sense of peace settle over him. The storm had tested them, broken them in ways they hadn't expected. But it had also revealed their strength, their capacity for kindness, and their ability to rebuild, not just homes, but lives. Brookhaven was no longer just a place. It was a legacy of resilience, a testament to what they could achieve together. And Peyton knew, deep in his heart, that no matter what came next, they were ready. They were home.